Funding for This is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Emily Seiner, and this is Nashville. Today we're talking all about accents. Why do I say words one way and you say them another? Is it possible to change the way we sound? Do we want to? And it's your turn to talk, so call us and share your story or question at 615-760-2000. Have you been called out because of your accent? Do you sound different from your parents? Have you moved to a different city and noticed your voice change as a result? Call us 615-760-2000. Let's introduce our guests who will be here for the entire show. We have in studio Javaneh Hammat, a Nashvilleian originally from Iran, MTSU professor of Spanish and linguistics Rick Morris, and joining us via Zoom is actor and dialect coach Eric Singer. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Dr. Morris, I want to start with a basic question. What is an accent?
Great question to start with. So an accent is a perception of phonological distance between yourself and someone else or between two other people. It's not something that you have. So sometimes you'll hear people say, well, I have an accent and, my father doesn't, or something like that. Or people from Michigan don't have an accent, or things like that. We'll see that on social media. And it oversimplifies the situation. The fact is that everybody talks slightly different from everybody else, and we perceive that. So if I perceive that somebody sounds a little bit different from me, I'll think they have an accent compared to me, and they will probably have the same assessment going the other way. But if I think about it, when I listen to myself talk, I don't have an accent because I have no phonological distance from myself. I sound like myself. So everybody will have an accent. They'll perceive an accent in someone else, depending on who they're talking to.
So it's about how we sound, but also how we think about how we sound.
That's right. It's how you perceive yourself, or you can also gauge two other people. So you can be listening in on a conversation and think, oh, those two people have an accent, but you're still part of the equation.
And what makes an accent different than a dialect?
So the accent is the perception. A dialect is a word that's used to describe a variety of language that is sort of associated with a geographic area, right? And so we would talk about Southern dialect, Northern dialect. Those are very broad terms. We would consider that, say, London English is a dialect of English also. But an accent, remember, is going to be a perception of difference between you and someone who's some other speaker. And you may perceive a difference and you may not.
How would you describe your accent? It sounds like, you're in the South. It sounds like you did not grow up here.
Right. Well, you're absolutely right. I am from the North. Lived in the various northern states up until 1998, and I moved here, and I really have not adopted very many Southernisms. I think a lot of these things become established when we're quite young. I think if I had been maybe a teenager or a child when I moved here, I think I might sound more Southern. My daughter, who was born here, has some Southernisms, but she's much younger than I am. So I will own it. I live in the South, and I consider myself pretty Southern in many ways, but I know I don't sound Southern.
Yeah. Java, can you tell me a little bit about your linguistic journey?
Absolutely. I was born to Persian parents in United Arab Emirates, and my father's vision for my sister and I was to learn 3 languages by the time we were 3. So we spoke Farsi at home. Arabic is the language of the Emirates. And English was the language that connected us to the rest of the world. So I'm very grateful for those early years and how we were given that gift of multiculturalism in the UAE. And at age 4, as a family, we traveled around the Western Hemisphere. And of course, one of the destinations was Disney World. And coming from the desert and being around big, fluffy animals and Mickey Mouse and Goofy, of course, this is where I wanted to live when I grew up. So the inspired action was we need to learn English properly. So when I went back home after that trip, we learned, and I studied English as a third language. And over the years, it has evolved from what I learned from teachers who were Irish, South African, Lebanese, Canadian, and naturally we mimic what our teachers teach us. And it has evolved into what I speak today.
What has been the hardest part about adopting an Americanized accent? Like, are there certain words or sounds that stumped you for a period of time?
For sure. I think when I sort of shifted the way I spoke, I also had to adopt the humor and the slang in order for my message to make sense to Americans. So the accent is one component, but the meaning of what I'm trying to say comes into play too.
That's really interesting. Eric, as someone who helps people adopt new accents as a dialect coach, how would you describe your technique for doing that?
Great question. I mean, every person is a little bit different in terms of how they learn, and every sort of project is a little bit different in terms of what we're trying to do. But generally speaking, the first thing we're doing for a movie or a TV show is finding a native speaker, a model for whatever the target accent is. So if the character is a sort of middle-class housewife in Manchester, we're going to go looking for somebody who is actually a middle-class housewife in Manchester as a possible sort of accent model, and usually try to find, a few options for that and kind of settle on one that feels like it makes the most sense. After that, we're breaking down the accent into its, sort of component pieces, which it's kind of helpful to think of them as being in three basic categories. One is the first thing, the most obvious thing that people think of is just the specific individual sounds, right? Is what are those specific vowel sounds and consonant sounds that go into this accent. The other is the sort of the glue that ties that together, which we tend to call oral posture, which is kind of the characteristic habitual settings for the tongue and the lips and the jaw, the various moving pieces, squishy bits of the vocal tract, because that's, every accent, every language has its characteristic settings there that sort of, make sense of the inventory of sounds, help them all fit together. So we really want to kind of shift. That's why, you feel like, when you speak multiple languages, more than one language, you usually feel like you have a different mouth, right? You're trading one for another. And then the third big piece is the music of an accent, what we call intonation or prosody. So that's the rise and fall of pitch and stress and rhythm and things like that. So then we're sort of, just kind of attending to those things one at a time, putting the pieces together, getting really good at training the muscles, because speaking is a connected series of physical actions, just like, any other complex thing like driving a car or riding a horse or fighting with a sword or something like that. So it takes some time then to kind of, set new muscle memory for all of those things and then put it all together. And then, of course, you've got to have long enough with it and spend enough time with it that it becomes second nature. So that's the sort of the process in a nutshell.
It gives me a deeper appreciation for just how we talk every day without even thinking about it, that all of that goes into it, even when we're not trying to mimic someone else's accent, when we're just speaking as ourselves.
It's the most complex thing that we do, fundamentally. I mean, it's real. I mean, language is extraordinarily complex, and language is really spoken. We tend to think of language as being primarily written, but writing came along very late. And it is just physically, certainly neurologically, but physically, it's an incredibly complex series of physical actions. And you're right, we do it without thinking about it at all. It's kind of an amazing magic when you sort of start to look under the hood.
I want to go to our first caller, Noah from Franklin. Noah, what's on your mind about accents?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that growing up, I was kind of ashamed to be from rural Tennessee, not getting to travel that much, but it wasn't until after I traveled outside of the state for a while and came back home that I was proud to be where I was from. And I feel like I picked up much more of an accent coming back at 20 years old than when I was growing up. I feel like I gained an accent later on in life.
That's so interesting. Dr. Morris, I'm curious how much psychology goes into either trying to get rid of an accent or gaining an accent. Like Noah's talking about feeling ashamed when he's growing up and then coming back and feeling really proud. Does that affect how we talk?
Yeah, well, there would be difference between a younger person and a 20-year-old. Absolutely. Changing from one sort of mode of speech to another can depend a lot on how you value both your choices, right? So if at one stage in your life you found that speaking Southern was somehow not advantageous socially or professionally or something like that, it wasn't cool enough, then it would make sense that you might want to sort of downplay that. It also makes sense that coming back to the area, which I believe Noah said he did after a couple of years, and feeling proud about it, could just be, time changes, but it could also be that in a place like Nashville, Franklin, speaking with a Southern accent is very normal, right? And it actually does not necessarily sort of crimp anybody's professional chances. It's sort of in the air, and it's not stigmatized or looked down on the way that it is in other parts of the country.
Noah, does that resonate with you?
Yeah, it absolutely does.
Well, thank you so much for calling in. And we're going to talk more about Southern accents later in the show. If you're just tuning in, this is Nashville, and I'm your host, Emily Seiner. Join the conversation with a story or question about this topic at 615-760-2000. Java, you own a business in Nashville, Hummuschik, or do you pronounce it Hummuschik?
Up to you. It is Hummuschik. Yeah.
Yeah, that word itself is sort of like pronounced differently depending on an accent. I would imagine that sounding Middle Eastern when you make Middle Eastern cuisine might be a benefit. Do you ever feel self-conscious that you don't?
Well, my accent shifts based on the zip code and who I'm speaking with. And I found that the thicker my accent was, it sometimes signaled a gap in expertise and a signal in learning and knowledge. So the way I try to compose my sentences and the way I speak to people, I try to keep the listener in mind, or in my business's case, my buyers and retailers in mind, and what is comprehensible to them. So I found myself positioning my sales pitches and my marketing to where it's relatable, it's easy to understand, and to take the responsibility off of my customers and buyers from having to work too hard to understand.
Mm-hmm. Are there times when it does feel advantageous to kind of code switch into a more accented English?
Sometimes. I mean, it depends on the content. It depends on the energy that's being exchanged between myself and, in this case, the buyer or the customer. So I really have to follow my intuition at times and adjust as I go.
Yeah. Is that happening consciously or subconsciously?
I think at this point it's intuitive. Yes. I pick it up very easily.
Yeah. Eric, I'm curious for you, since you're kind of taking on accents willingly and consciously, do you have a story of how you're perceived differently depending on what accent you're trying on?
That is a great question. I don't. I think I feel a little shy, sort of doing accents when I'm not, when there's not a reason to and it's not expected. So I actually don't. Although I recommend when people are learning accents, the more practice, the better, right? So you absolutely take it out into the world. You should, be able to have interactions and buy things and be in a restaurant and hang out with people in an accent to get it to be really second nature. And I did that myself a very long time ago. I mean, my origin story was, I was training in drama school in England, and I wanted to stay and work there. And, American actors in England, there are plenty, but they basically only play American roles. If you want to be able to do more than that, do Shakespeare at the National, people have to think you're English, right? So I sort of perfected it to that spy standard. But I don't do that these days. So it would be an interesting experiment. But I can't say I go and kind of do, linguists have what they call matched guise tests, right? Where we're sort of testing people's attitudes towards different accents by having somebody who can do, can speak more than one accent, more than one dialect, with native-like proficiency. And they'll have them, say various things, and they'll play these recordings back mixed in with other people to sort of try to test, well, are your attitudes more positive or negative towards this accent? It's the same person, right, doing it. But I have not gone and sort of done my own matched guise tests in the world. So I don't know, but we do know that, people's perceptions of and the associations that they bring to different accents are very, 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 very rich, right? We have a lot of ideas about the people who talk that way. And most of those things obviously are very broad stereotypes and don't apply to individual people. That's, certainly relevant when we're talking about Southern accents. But it is nevertheless part of, it's part of our inbuilt equipment as humans to do that.
Yeah. Let's go to our next caller, Skippy from Clarksville. Skippy, welcome to This is Nashville. What's on your mind?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I'm a trained actor. I am currently enrolled in the vocal performance program at APSU here in Clarksville. My father immigrated here from Ukraine and had a thick accent. And I grew up, to this day, people, will occasionally say, "Oh, where are you from?" They detect an accent. And, I'm always fascinated with how people sound and people's voices. And I wonder if that's common with I didn't speak Ukrainian at home. I was raised in Connecticut by my mother, but I interacted with my father. And is it common for someone who has a parent or a family with accents to sort of acquire something? Because obviously I do not have a Ukrainian accent, but
yeah, like the ghost of an accent through the generations.
Exactly. Yeah.
Rick, what do you make of that as our resident linguist?
So, Skippy, do you consider that you have any kind of a residual accent? Because I don't really hear anything.
No, and that and I'm always surprised when someone makes that comment. But the frequency, it's remarkable.
Do you think they make that comment after they know your sort of background, or do they make it?
Absolutely not. No.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
We're stumped just from hearing you.
Well, I definitely don't hear any Ukrainian there either, Skippy. People are individuals, so there's always outliers. There's always the exception that proves the rule. But the general rule of thumb is that we don't sound like our parents. We tend to say that we grew up sounding like our peers, not our parents, because it is, and obviously our parents are our caregivers, so they are our first teachers, and very young children, absolutely, they're patterning after, especially a primary caregiver. That starts to change as soon as we go to school and start to have peers. It's all the more so when your parent is not a native speaker of the language that you are immersed in and learning as soon as you start to go to school. And then when we get to to be teenagers, there's another big break. So it's there's a break between pre-adolescence accents and adolescence accents, where pre-adolescents, they actually line up. They don't necessarily sound exactly like their parents, but they line up very well with their parents' sort of class and education, sort of socioeconomic background. And then teenagers much less so, because they are then sort of building their own social worlds and kind of choosing their own social categories. So it is definitely pretty rare to find, other than a straight pronunciation or something, for most people to sort of have a lot of influence from their parents' accents. Some unusual words, maybe things like that. And then, where there are exceptions, it's going to be, there's a particularly strong sympathy identification, something like that, right? So it's certainly not impossible, but that's generally how it works.
Thanks for calling in,
It
Skippy.
will remain a mystery. Yeah, thank you. This is great programming.
Thank you. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk more about the Southern accent. Is it disappearing? What does that mean? We'll be right back. This is Nashville.
Funding for This Is Nashville comes from Burr and Foreman Law Firm, serving clients with transactional, litigation, and regulatory needs. Discovering how each client defines a win and working with them every step of the way to achieve it. Burr.com. Funding for This Is Nashville comes from Nobody Trashes Tennessee, the state of Tennessee's official litter prevention campaign, managed by TDOT. Details on how to be part of the solution to end littering at nobodytrashestennessee.com.
I'm Emily Seiner, and this is Nashville. If you're just joining us, we're talking all about accents on today's show. I'd like to welcome our guests back, Java Hemmat, local small business owner of Hummus Chick, MTSU professor of Spanish and linguistics Rick Morris, and actor and dialect coach Eric Singer. And we want to hear from you. Call us with your own questions or stories about the way you sound at 615-760-2000. I want to discuss an article that came out this month from the Associated Press that says the Southern accent is disappearing, which I've seen this claim made before. Dr. Morris, to start, when people talk about the Southern accent, what are they referring to?
Well, they're usually referring to a handful of features that relate to sound. It can relate to intonation and prosody, which is kind of the rhythm of how people speak. It can refer to how certain words are used. For example, the word Coke, right, which in some places can mean Coke, and in some places it can mean any soft drink, right? So there are all sorts of different axes involved. But a couple of the sort of hallmark distinctive features of Southern would be something called monophthongization. This is pretty widespread. Basically, what that means is that a word that would be maybe pronounced with what's called a diphthong in the North. So, for example, a word like light or tie, you hear that there's a little bit of a glided vowel in those words. In the Southern dialect zone, these tend to be pronounced with a monophthong, which means a steady state vowel, and that would mean a pronunciation more like lat or ta, and that's very, very common in the South, in addition to all the things we know of like y'all and so on.
Can you explain why this accent or this collection of accents that we call kind of a Southern accent might be fading?
Yeah, there's two reasons. The youngest generation, we would say maybe Gen Z, is not clinging to Southern English the way that this is called young retreat. They're not adopting it and using it with the sort of vigor or vitality that's usually associated with the variety that is strong. And there's a couple of different reasons for that. We know that Gen Z is very tech-focused, and a lot of their input comes from dialect areas that are outside the South, right? And so it could be that part of it is just there's a lost coolness factor in speaking Southern English, even though we're surrounded by it. So there's that. And also the most reliable speakers, as it were, of Southern English tend to be older speakers in rural areas. Well, that would put them less in contact with Northern varieties. But the older speakers are not going to be around much longer. So we have two indicators that actually Southern English is, at least in some of the most important ways, in a state of fading.
Yeah, I'm curious, Eric, do you buy this premise that the Southern accent is going away?
Well, I mean, accents are always changing, right? I mean, all accents are always in the process of changing from one thing into another. So, Southern accents are changing, like all accents are changing. There will still be Southern accents. Ultimately, fundamentally, are a very deep reflection of our sort of our felt sense of identity. Who our tribe is, who we belong with, who we don't belong with. In very complicated ways, right? Because that's not one thing for anybody, right? We're different people with different groups of people, and so they're all sort of overlapping together. But we are, our accents, as I was kind of mentioning before, are primarily formed in adolescence, and they can shift a little bit later on in life, right? But that's the really kind of intense period of accent formation, because it's also the really intense period of identity formation, right? Of who am I? You're trying things on. certain things are sticking and certain things aren't. And then you construct this individual identity kind of in part out of overlapping groups, right, of who you belong with. So, I mean, the other major factor that's affecting Southern accents, and this is more broadly across the entire, the entire West, the entire world too, is sort of mobility, is just how much people are, moving to different places. There's been a huge, obviously, flow of people coming to the South from the North over the past, number of decades. And there are some very broad trends especially in, college students and people with college degrees who tend to be a little bit more mobile, of, kind of broadly leveling accents. And so that does appear to be where we're seeing the biggest effect in the South. A lot of the AP article was based on, some very exciting and important and interesting recent research. But it's not definitive yet, right? One of the things with a lot of that research is it really has been just measuring college students. In Texas, there are, we're finding in the big cities that a lot of this leveling and kind of, diluting and sort of fading out of the Southern accent is happening, but the exact opposite is happening in rural areas. So, it is a complicated story, but as long as there is an identity that matters to somebody, that is, I am from this place, there will be an accent that says that.
Yeah, what this article also talks about is that there's some amount of sadness that people feel around the loss of an accent, that, your accent is a form of your identity. Java, do you feel that way about shedding your Middle Eastern accent, that there was kind of a part of you that you had to hide?
I think for a long time, I tried to hold on to it as much as I could. And I realized that by letting it go, I'm gaining something new. And that new thing is going to shape and form me in a way that I wasn't before. And who knows, it might change again over time, and where I live next and who I speak to next. So,
you mentioned to our managing editor that 9/11 was a really formative moment for you in terms of how you decided how to sound. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I was a student at university when 9/11 happened. And before then, my thinking process was that I would think in Farsi, translate into Arabic, then into English. So if you can imagine the Rolodex of words going on all at the same time. And when 9/11 happened, I had to take a protective measure and start writing grocery lists and writing my journals in English instead of Arabic or Farsi. And now that I think about it, that created a practice where I would think and write and speak in English as a primary language and not as a tertiary language. And that shifted the way I spoke, the way I thought about things. And there is a little bit of a grief on letting that go, because I do miss the handwritten notes around the house and pages in a journal. But again, I've gained something else, more fluency over the language, more quick thinking, better comprehension, hopefully better communication.
Yeah, that's a really complex evolution.
Yes, and this was happening during a time where we didn't have a broad, diverse, and inclusive conversation around, immigrants and those that have come here. So it was a bit of an interesting path to navigate.
Yeah. If you're just tuning in, this is Nashville, and I'm your host, Emily Seiner, and you can call us at 615-760-2000 to share your own stories or questions. I think we have another caller, Drew from Smyrna. You are on This is Nashville. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
What's on your mind?
So a little bit of a little background on my accent. I'm from the South, which was where my mom's family is from, and my dad is from Oregon. So I've always been aware, visiting Oregon, that I have a Southern accent, and I love it, especially when people always ask, say y'all, or, tell me about living in the South, just from hearing my accent. They get so fascinated when they hear you traveling. And I've always loved that. But something you mentioned earlier made me think back to whenever I've gone on interviews throughout my life. I've had several times where people will stop me in the middle of an interview and say, wait a minute, where are you from? Because at the beginning of the interview, you're enunciating, you sounded like you're from the Midwest. And then halfway through the interview, I start to relax and start to come out a little bit with my accent. And and so I just thought it was funny how subconsciously you might not even be aware that you're shaping your accent, just based on who you're talking to.
Yeah, Dr. Morris, I'm going to go to you again for this one, but what do you make of that?
Well, it's very interesting. There's a phenomenon called audience design. Basically, and this is what Java was alluding to a minute ago. Basically, audience design is when you adapt the way that you're speaking to the perceived needs or of whoever it is you're speaking to, right? And so in an interview situation, if you're aware that the person who's interviewing you speaks a certain way, you might adapt the way that you speak to sort of match them a little bit. It's subconscious to do this. It makes sense that we would do it because, generally speaking, we want people to be listening to what we're saying and not be overly focused on how we're saying it.
I love that term. I feel like it makes it sound very fancy, what we're doing in a natural way. Drew, does that sound like what you've experienced?
Oh, 100%. And, from early life, I've always known to enunciate, but I was never told to be wary of my accent. We're very, proud of our accents. But I think whenever I'm in a situation like this, naturally, subconsciously, because of my audience, I want to enunciate and be more formal and make sure that I'm communicating in a way that I know is going to be received.
Yeah. Thank you so much for calling in, Drew. And Eric, I know many journalists and even in public radio who sound different on air than they do when talking to friends or family. We call it NPR voice. And it's been a big topic of conversation over the past decade or so. What are the social constructs that have so much power in how we sound?
That is a fantastic question. And I think the single most important thing to realize, and it's really important that we kind of keep talking about this, keep trying to sort of get this message out there. I think we should have some basic linguistic education as part of primary and secondary education, because all accents and all dialects, all ways of speaking spoken by native speakers, they are equal. They are, linguistically speaking, they're equal. They are as complex, as rule-bound, as systematic, as capable of, eloquence and articulate expression and describing whatever needs to be described. And, we don't think that. We have this, it's practically across the board, right? It's people think, even kind of just deeply and instinctively, that Northern accents sound smart and educated, or, even more so, like all the way towards the RP end of the spectrum, right? So sort of standard British English, right? This is really smart and competent. It's why all the bad guys are RP speakers, right? And Southern accents are, less educated, less intelligent. They're not, of course, right? But, the only way that accents actually differ in this way, it's just the social evaluation. It's just what we sort of, have decided to put on top of it. And so, it's hard to deconstruct that. But it's really, without deconstructing that, we just end up kind of, redoing this bias and this discrimination. And it has real world effects. It has effects on housing and employment and justice. People go to jail or not go to jail, based on like the credibility, that the jury assigns to a witness, depending on, how they speak. So, dialect coaches are sometimes approached by, a non-actor for us as a civilian, to kind of change the way to change their native accent. And this is different if we're talking about, somebody like Java, who's obviously worked very hard, on English pronunciation. We're talking really about, people who are unhappy with a native speaker accent that they have, wanting to change to some other kind of native speaker accent, a Southern accent, someone wanting to trade that in for a Northern accent. And, That's a really complex proposition because, any one individual person might have some very good reasons for wanting to do something like that. But overall, it's really society that should change, not that person.
We're going to take one more break and then keep talking about this a little bit more. Give us a call, 615-760-2000. Share your own stories about accents and how you sound. We'll be right back. This is Nashville.
Funding for This is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Emily Seiner, and this is Nashville. We've been talking about accents with actor and dialect coach Eric Singer, Java Hamat, local small business owner of Hummuschick, and MTSU professor of Spanish and linguistics, Rick Morris. But we're also talking with you, so give us a call at 615-760-2000. We were just talking about the tension between potentially wanting to change your accent and the kind of complicated ideas that go into that. I remember covering a story back in 2014 about Oak Ridge National Laboratory in East Tennessee. They offered a Southern accent reduction class, and it caused this huge controversy, and they quickly canceled it. And it was sort of like, on one side, why should you have to change the way you talk to be taken seriously, in this case, as a scientist? But on the other side, it was like, well, this is the reality of the world, like that other people are judging you. Eric said, this really falls on society. But I'm curious for Dr. Morris and Java, where do you fall on that spectrum of this is a personal responsibility that just has to be, an unfortunate reality maybe, but it's a reality versus embrace who you are?
I think for me, it's easier to take the responsibility than to have the expectation for the society to change. And although it would be really fun to sort of be lazy about it and expect other things around me to change. So it's a very personal thing for me. And I also find that to be really beautiful to learn different things about myself and all the different ways I can sound. There's an element of creativity, and it's fun and sometimes frustrating. So it's definitely part of my personal growth journey.
Yeah, and it sounds like an element of self-discovery even, like you're taking on these different, not personas, but elements of yourself.
Absolutely. There's so many versions of the way I speak, and at times I want to share all of them, but sometimes they take time to develop. Sometimes I stick to what makes sense to me, but it's definitely a personal responsibility.
Dr. Morris, what about you?
Well, it's absolutely true what Eric says about all the different varieties being equal. There is no one that is more or less correct than any other. We can say that certain varieties may be stigmatized, is the word that's often used, which means that they're assigned some kind of a negative social evaluation. It's funny that you mentioned Oak Ridge. I'm going to continue my answer with an anecdote, if you don't mind.
Love it.
I have a friend I've known many years who's from Oak Ridge, and she comes from a Southern family, obviously. Everyone in her family, alive or deceased, speaks with what I would judge as a strong Southern accent, except for her. And I wondered early on, why is this? And the facts of her life kind of indicate the answer, that she is a medical person, sort of highly involved in the medical profession, corporate medicine, lots and lots of interaction with companies on the West Coast, on the East Coast, and so on. Lots of interaction with people outside the Southern dialect area, and that's very telling. I think what happened in her case, it was not so much a matter of intuitive audience design, which is what Java was describing, as just sort of subconscious. I think over time, people will decide that people their listeners are too attentive or might be too attentive to the way that they're speaking rather than what they're saying, and subconsciously modify the way that they talk. So we're back to that audience design again, based on a perception. In this case, it's subconscious. And I think in honesty, most of the changes that are taking place in the Southern dialect zone where Northern sounds are kind of encroaching, I think this is all subconscious. I think people are doing this without feeling that they have to. I think they're just doing it because it's just happening. There may be practical reasons for it. There may be personal reasons. But in her case, she had no idea she was doing it until I pointed it out.
That's really interesting. Our phone line is blowing up, so we're going to go to Chantel in Nashville. Chantel, welcome to This is Nashville. What's on your mind?
Hi, sorry, I had you on mute there. I just wanted to call in because I'm originally from Australia, and I get "where are you from?" all the time. I don't think I have much more of my accent left, but it's hard to know because I don't really hear it myself unless I'm putting it on thickly. And when I say that, it's when I'm in a meeting. My kids have IEP meetings at school and I want to sound official, I will kind of put it on a little bit more. And I notice the difference between when I do that, I become more of I don't know, it's like an authority on what I'm talking about. People will listen more. They think I know more than I do. It's a strange psychology. So, I mean, when we moved originally in 1987, I was 15, so I went from Australian school straight into an American school, and it was the time of Australia being very popular. It was Crocodile Dundee, it was koala blue stores everywhere. So I noticed everyone wanted to talk to me. Everyone wanted me to say something. And in school, especially when you're moving countries, the last thing you want to do is talk to anyone. You just want to blend into the background. So it was an interesting time. And I think it's more like it's a timestamp now. Every time I talk, now that I've moved from Los Angeles to Nashville, it's changing again. And it's sort of time-stamping everything. And I notice a difference in how I'm speaking.
That's really interesting. What do you notice now about moving to Nashville? How has your voice changed?
Well, I noticed that the Southern accent is a little easier to pick up when you're not even noticing it. I think it is closer to an Australian accent, interestingly. So it's a little more sing-songy. It blends in. You know, I don't have my R's sometimes. I really have to think about hitting those R's, especially when I'm on the phone and I'm on some automated line. It will completely not pick up what I'm saying if I don't roll my R. But I think it's a little easier for me to morph into that Southern accent from an Australian than it was when I was in California.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much for calling in. And, you know, we were talking in the last segment about the pressure to lose Southern accents, but I also wonder if there's some societal pressure now to gain it. You know, I'm thinking of, there's a particular politician who I've noticed over the years has started to really draw out their ahs and kind of like almost in a what I imagine is like a bid for authenticity. Have you noticed that shifting at all in the years that you've been here?
No, it's a phenomenon that's fairly common, though. Some of the classic cases of that, we would consider that maybe performance dialect. So, for example, if you go to North Carolina, you go to the Outer Banks there, there is a very distinct dialect spoken there, the Hoi-Toid dialect. In fact, the name itself comes from the way that the locals pronounce high tide, Hoi-Toid, which we would agree is probably a little bit unusual sounding in the South or anywhere. And this is considered a performance dialect. There have been studies done that have found that people who live there will actually use particular features of that dialect more frequently when they know that outsiders are listening in. Which is fascinating if you think about that. We see a version of that here in Nashville also in the tourist industry. At least I've I've noticed it a little bit that when in tourist venues or in typically Southern restaurants, for example, I think you're much more likely to hear y'alls and dearies and come back nows and things like that than you might be in a place that catered solely to Southern people.
Interesting. Yeah. Let's go to one more caller, Mason in Nashville. Mason, welcome to This is Nashville.
Hello, thank you. I'm going to try really hard to stay on topic here. So I graduated recently with my master's in speech-language pathology. So all of this is very much in my niche. And I'm originally from Oak Ridge, Tennessee also.
Oh,
so
great.
Just want to throw that out there too. But two things. Okay, so first thing I'm going to start with is I like how y'all are bringing up the importance of there's not like a superior dialect. In our field, when we're evaluating, one of our main goals is to educate staff. Like if I'm working in the school system or if I were to be working in the medical system, I would need to educate like staff, hey, just because this person speaks with a dialect that is different, that does not mean that it's inferior. And I feel like there's a tendency to, of course, automatically pull out a bias because of the way someone talks.
Yeah.
But there's that. And then I also wanted to bring up, so earlier we had the person who called in whose father was Ukrainian. And we were talking about influence on language and that sort of thing. I, of course, just being a recent graduate, only know so much. But I will say that when we are doing a full language evaluation, one of the things we do really want to consider is the parent's native language. Because even if the child does not speak the parent's native language, they still hear examples of that language being spoken in the household and the carryover from that language into English. So like a very clear example of that would be if you have a parent who speaks Spanish with a lot of dialects of Spanish. Of course, granted, I know there's a Spanish linguist on here, so correct me if I'm wrong. But with a lot of dialects of Spanish, it's very common to drop the S at the end of words. And so even if the child does not speak Spanish themselves, they may still exhibit this behavior. So I'm just curious, any thoughts on that, if that was clear?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Thanks for that observation. And I saw you nodding along.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. The phenomenon you're talking about is aspiration, dropping the S. And yeah, it could, the phonologies are very portable between languages. And that I can see that would be a consideration in speech language pathology. This phenomenon that we're talking about can be scaled up to sort of the South in general, right? When we think about how as people are moving in from other areas, huge influx, mostly, overwhelmingly, from places outside the Southern dialect zone, we can see that that's going to have an effect, even if we don't necessarily interact with a bunch of people from California, right, or from New York or wherever. We can see that would change the flavor of the language as it's spoken in the city. And even subconsciously, we are very attentive to the speech community, which is sort of how the language sounds around us at any given time.
Really quickly, just to wrap up, I want to ask a philosophical question in just a few seconds. Eric, what would you say is your relationship with your accent?
Oh God, I don't know. I had to do a little bit of reconstruction. I think I hopefully I speak the way I did when I was growing up, but I've been through so many different things since that I can't be totally sure.
Chava, what about you?
I would say curious and try to always keep it as open-minded and relatable as possible.
Yeah. And Dr. Morris?
Sort of a mostly northern melting pot. I've got some coastal U.S. I've got some Midwest. I've got a little bit of Northeast. I call it soda instead of pop, which is supposedly unusual. And I've also retained some unusual, from a national perspective, features from Ohio English that I must have picked up during my 8 years there. So I know I sound northern, but I don't think anybody could possibly guess where in the north I'm actually from.
Well, Java, Rick, and Eric, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for tuning in this hour and giving us some great calls. This is Nashville is a production of Nashville Public Radio. Today's episode was produced by Josh Deepan and Liv Lombardi. It was directed by Tasha A.F. Lemley. Answering the phone is Catherine Ruppelt. Our board operator is Liv Lombardi, and our theme music is by Larange and Namir Blade. Listen back at thisisnashville.org or wherever you get good podcasts. The conversation doesn't end here. Leave us a message at 615-751-2500. You can also find us on Blue Sky and Instagram and X at This Is Nashville. I'm Emily Seiner. This is Nashville. We'll see you tomorrow, everybody.